Hi guys, I'm going to give you a quick little rundown on how we do vesselization and a little introduction of the kind of information it can tell us. This is based off of a lecture I usually give during one of our lab programs, our lab expedition programs. So forgive the March 2019 date. So we're going to start here looking at glass and ceramic vesselization. So what is vesselizing? So vesselizing is the process of associating ceramic or glass sherds from across the site or even sites with each other and determining what their form is as a whole. So this is really the process where you take the broken pieces and you put them back together. It's like doing this insanely huge jigsaw puzzle where you only have some of the pieces for really a puzzle that's made out of hundreds of different littler puzzles. So you're missing pieces, they're mixed in with other pieces, some are discovered and you have right in front of you, some were discovered 10 years earlier, some haven't been uncovered yet. Sometimes you know what the puzzle's supposed to look like, you have an idea of what this vessel is supposed to look like as a whole, kind of the picture on the box, and sometimes you have no idea because you're not sure yet what you have found. So it can be a really fun process because there's a whole lot of discovery that happens during the vesselization process. So why do we vesselize besides the fact that, doing puzzles is sort of fun? The biggest reason we vesselize is it gives us a really much better accurate count for the amount of ceramics or glass vessels that were on the site. So if you just counted sherds, that could be really skewed by how a specific plate or bowl was broken. So if you imagine you drop a plate on the ground one time, it breaks into two pieces. You have a count of 2. But if you picked up those pieces and dropped it again and again and again, and it kept breaking, you could end up with 1,000 pieces. And if you're just counting sherds, 1,000 seems a lot bigger than 2, even though they're all coming from the same vessel. It also gives us better form identification. So a form is it a plate? Is it a bowl? Is it a teacup? Is it a saucer? Just looking at sherds, sometimes you can tell if something is a flatware or a hollowware, so like a plate or a bowl. But there's so many different specific types of vessels, particularly in the early 19th century. Vessels for very specific foods. So if you can imagine, there were vessels specifically designed to hold asparagus. There were vessels specifically designed to hold soap or razors. So it's not just foods. There's vessels specifically designed for mineral water versus wine. Those things can't really be identified until you see the form of the vessel. So this becomes really important for understanding how these objects were used in the past. The other thing that vesselization does and how it really fits into this discussion of understanding artifact assemblages is it gives us the ability to connect different deposits and features and use areas across the property with each other. So if you find fragments of the same vessel in a post hole, in a wall trench, in a trash deposit, all of a sudden you can connect those depositional episodes with each other. It becomes a really important tool for dating. It becomes a really important tool for understanding relative stratigraphy. These are really exciting ways to understand how different parts of the property were connected in the past. And it also gives us a lot of information about how vessels were used and then also how they were deposited. So by understanding form, we have a better understanding of use. We know who used them, more likely when we kind of look at a whole vessel rather than just a ceramic sherd. But we also understand how they were deposited a little bit better. So I like to think about this in a couple of different ways. One is we have a very large trash pit, sometimes nicknamed Dolly's Midden, that is on one side of the property. And that would have been the main trash pit for the dining room of the main house. So if you imagine at the end of the night at dinner, the enslaved community is clearing the table, all the leftover trash from dinner gets dumped into a basket and then carried into that trash pit. So if one of the Madisons or one of their guests accidentally dropped a glass and broke it, or slammed their hand on the table and broke a plate, that would just be swept in with the rest of the trash from dinner and deposited all into the trash pit. So you're likely to find, almost really close to complete vessels because they're kind of broken and deposited. Another way things could get deposited is maybe they're partially broken and a little piece gets thrown out, like a chip or a small section, and then the rest of the vessel continues to be used, and then later on it breaks and it's deposited in a different location from the original piece was thrown away. But finally, what if you have one of those vessels from the Madisons, but instead of them or one of their guests accidentally breaking it, it's one of the members of the enslaved community? And then we start to think about, well, what would I do if I had broken one of the Madison plates? Would I go up and tell them, or would I maybe try to hide it? And so if I broke a big plate, I probably am not going to go just dump it right in the trash pit on top where anybody can see it. Maybe I'll scatter the pieces across the property so they're all spread out. I often like to call this the Shawshank theory. If you have seen the movie The Shawshank Redemption, when he's digging out his wall, he would bring the fragments from his wall in onto the yard through his pocket and then deposit them as he walked around so nobody would see. And I imagine sort of members of the enslaved community maybe doing something similar, where they accidentally broke maybe one of the Madison serving platters or dishes, and they're scattering them as they're walking across the property. So there's never that big find of what had happened. The go-to resource for a lot of this is Voss and Allen's 2010 Guide to Ceramic Minimum Number of Vessel Calculation. This article is included in your materials section as a really great reference resource, and it really guides how we do our vesselization here at Montpelier and how a lot of archaeologists do it. So the minimum number of vessels, or MNV, is the fewest number of vessels based on the attributes recovered. So these are determined in a couple of ways. One way is by the form. So you can have fragments of vessels maybe in the same pattern or the same decorative style, but they're in different forms. So imagine a teacup and a saucer, two different vessels, similar decorations, but different forms. The parts of the vessel. So if you can imagine, again, like a teapot, you're only going to have one spout on a teapot, one handle. So if you find two spouts or two handles, you know you have more than one vessel. Decorative attributes. That's what you're seeing right here. So these are two saucers or two plates, sorry, they're plates in the same transfer printed pattern that depicts a sporting scene, so kind of an archery scene. And in that whole vessel, there's only ever one target depicted in that scene. And you can see we've recovered two different fragments that each have a target on them. So we know that we have to have at least two different vessels in this same pattern because we have two of these targets. And then there's other unique characteristics. Maybe there's something really unique about the wear on the vessel, the markings on the vessel, maybe on glass, the patina pattern, something along those lines that makes it really, really unique, that we can attribute certain pieces with each other and not with other vessels. We're just starting to look into how vessels show up across the landscape. So this is one of our earliest attempts with GIS a few years ago to map in the fragments of the sherds of vessels across the landscape to see where the different pieces of vessels are showing up. And we wanted to do this for a couple reasons. One, we thought maybe this would be a good way to cross-check ourselves. Were we putting sherds of vessels together that maybe don't really have that much of a relationship with each other? Another way would be to look at these vessels and try to figure out what is the distribution, what is the human behavior that's affecting why some pieces of a vessel are on one side of the main house and some are on the other side of the main house, or one end of the south yard or at the other end of the south yard. So this was sort of the first step that was taken on by one of our former employees named DJ Barry. And then this work was followed up by Hannah James, and in the material section I've also included a paper she wrote for an archaeological conference where she went through tons of data and tried to figure out what we can do with it in GIS. The biggest thing she learned is we need to get our data really cleaned up before we can start to answer and ask these really big questions. So let's talk really specifically about ceramics. Most of our vesselization happens with ceramics, so we have kind of our own terms, our own language for talking about them. So the first word you need to know is a mend. Now, this isn't a word that only applies to ceramics. It applies to any artifact that you have two pieces of and they fit together, they mend together. So they were broken and they're a perfect puzzle piece with each other back together. So what you can see in this picture here are three different mends where two pieces fit together perfectly. For vesselizing, the next thing we have is what we call a friend. And it's the combination of the mends and the friends which make a vessel. So friends are pieces that don't mend together, so you can't just stick them together, but we know or really strongly, or they suggest really strongly are part of the same vessel. So they have the same decoration type, they're the same form, they're maybe their condition, their wearing looks the same. So the ones at the bottom here are the friends, and they are friends with the mends up there. And all the mends are friends with each other, forming a vessel. So they make a nice little family, our mends and our friends. So another kind of term that we use here at Montpelier is set. So the idea behind using the word set was to figure out if we have vessels that were purchased at the same time, but were in different forms. So if you can imagine a tea set, you would buy a teapot, a sucre, which is a fancy word for a sugar dish, a creamer, you would buy teacups, you would buy saucers, you would buy waste bowls, you would buy a whole tea set. They would be part of the same set. And we would expect that all of the vessels in the same set would have the same decoration type, would look very similar, would have been produced at the same time. So we started trying to figure out how can we connect all of these hundreds of vessels that we have into these sets? And what we quickly discovered is this idea of looking at sets only really works when we're talking about the ceramics that were owned and purchased by the Madisons, because the Madisons are purchasing in sets. They're buying an entire tea set at once. They're buying an entire dining set at once. A dining set is going to be at least 300 different vessels during this time. But the majority of the ceramics we have on the property and in our archaeological collection actually don't come from the Madisons. They actually come from the enslaved community. And what we see with the enslaved community is they're not buying sets of vessels. They're buying vessels one or two pieces at a time, maybe just cups and saucers without the matching teapot and sugar and coffee dispensers. They are buying in much fewer numbers, but in greater variety. Because they're buying these one or two or a small number at a time, they're buying what is available at the time, what they like and what they're interested in, rather these large matching sets. So we have sort of this legacy of organizing our vessels in sets, even though it doesn't exactly shake out as the best way to determine vessel association across the property universally. We also have decoration or pattern. So the decoration or the pattern is the design on the ceramic. And the one design could be made by multiple manufacturers with different variations. So to give you an example, willow is a pattern. It is a really, really commonly produced pattern made by British manufacturers in what's called chinoiseries. So what the British or what Europeans thought Chinese design should look like. They've looked at Chinese export porcelains, they've copied and then sort of embellished those designs and created their own. And so willow is so common, you can buy it today. You can buy a pair of Doc Martens with the pattern on it. You can see it pretty much everywhere. Almost all of your grandmothers are gonna have something with this pattern on it. So willow is this hugely common pattern. We know the Madisons own pieces in willow. We know members of the enslaved community own pieces in willow. But we also know that there's a lot of variation under willow. So we started to divide willow as this large decorative pattern into these different sets. We did that in some ways by wear type. So if you can see to the left, set 10 is willow that is made on a pearl wear type, and set 120 is a white wear type. Again, with the same decoration. There's also some variations in how willow is depicted, what the fence looks like, or how the trees are exactly drawn. That varies by manufacturer. So then we started to tease out those differences by manufacturer. What the bubble trees look like, how the birds exactly look. So taking those really specific things, we can start to, again, separate out and get closer to this idea of set. But with the enslaved community, again, with them purchasing just a few pieces at a time, what we started to realize is for most of our ceramics, we couldn't associate them with a set. We really just could associate them with a decoration or pattern type. So for ceramic analysis, there's quite a few steps. The very first thing that happens is something you guys are going to do while you're here is the sherds are excavated. They are sorted, so all the materials that are excavated are sorted into their material type. So iron goes with iron, ceramic goes with ceramic, glass goes with glass, and then they're cleaned. Then they're cataloged. So the cataloging process is when we turn artifacts into data. When we are cataloging ceramics, we pay special attention to the ware type. So is it a refined earthenware, a porcelain, a stoneware? A lot of attention to the color and the pattern and the styles of decoration. Decoration is really important for helping us in this process, particularly with some of the refined wares. After they're all cataloged, they get sorted into kind of different groups of likeness. So all the Chinese export porcelains go together, all the transfer prints go together, all the hand-painted pearl wares go together. And they're also separated within those groups between sherds that are greater than 2 centimeters squared and less than 2 centimeters squared. Now this G2, greater than 2 centimeters squared, is a measurement that is arbitrary. It is just one that we have picked that seems to work really well for us. So it's about 1 inch square. And we do that because once a sherd is bigger than 2 centimeters squared, we can comfortably fit a label on it to identify where it came from. And that label includes its site number, its inventory number, and its cataloging number. So it's quite a long number. It also means the sherd is big enough to really kind of do that sticking the pieces together process. We will sometimes go through those ones that are smaller than 2 centimeters squared and look for some really unique patterns that are coming out and be able to associate those with vessels, but that's always kind of a secondary act. So those greater than 2 centimeter sherds are labeled, and those are vesselized with the other pieces excavated from the same area during the same excavation season. So we start with everything we dug in 1 year, trying to see what mends together, again, by those different ware types. So we'll take all the Chinese export porcelains from 2020 and see how they fit together. And we'll do the same thing for each of the different ware types. Then what we'll do is we'll see, do those mend with pieces that were excavated at previous seasons and other sort of nearby areas to see how they mend across space. So the South Yard is a really good example of this. In 2015, we were excavating the smokehouse site where there was tons and tons of ceramics. So after we vesselized all of those, we then took those sort of mends and sort of vessel associations to see if we can match them up with the vessels from the kitchen quarter that was originally excavated in the 90s and then we returned to in 2016 to match with the double quarter complexes to see from 2014, 2012 to see what would go together. And then kind of identify those as whole vessels. So that was a really exciting process to connect to archaeology that had been done decades before, sometimes just years before, and across a pretty wide area. And we found some really amazing connections, not only across the South Yard, but even connecting some pieces to the stable quarter and other kind of nearby areas. Throughout this entire process, research is ongoing to identify the patterns, the forms, what the vessels are, and how they were used. So this is happening at every step along the way, from the time a piece is first discovered and maybe it catches somebody's eye, to years after the pieces are put together. Maybe we really still don't understand, you know, who the manufacturer was or what the whole picture is supposed to look like. So this is an ongoing process. We are constantly going back to our vessels. It's one of the few collections we actually keep in our lab because we're always working on it. We also do vesselization on glass. This really concentrates here at Montpelier on wine bottle glass or bottle glass. So again, we use a minimum number of vessels to vesselize our glass. It's very similar to the ceramic process. We make our determinations by the manufacturer type of the bottle. So is it a hand-blown bottle, a machine-made bottle? The form of the bottle, you can see in the lower area here, there is what's called a case bottle, kind of like a gin bottle that's very square, versus up to the top right, which is a bunch of pieces of wine bottle fragments. The parts of the vessels, so the tops, the bottoms, we know every bottle is going to have one bottom, one base, one finish, or one top. The color of the glass. Now this is a little harder because glass color changes with the thickness of the glass, so the bases can be quite a bit darker than sort of the body parts. But an olive glass versus a colorless glass versus an aqua glass can really show itself. Other unique characteristics. One that really shows out quite a bit to us is the amount of patina that's on the fragments. So it's the chemical contents of the glass that accounts for the patina variation rather than kind of what happens to it afterwards. So we can really connect pieces through that variation in patina or markings or kind of unique characteristics of glass. So how do we do it? So we use the bases to determine the minimum number of vessels. And we go with the bases because we know every bottle has a base and just one. And it's the thickest, strongest, sturdiest part of the bottle. And because it's that thickest part, it's most likely to stay intact and give us the most information. The next step is we look at the finishes. So finish of the bottle is the top of the bottle. So the neck, the closure, all of that at the mouth of the bottle, those make up the finish. So we can take all our finishes and we can say, okay, if we have 10 bases and 12 finishes, we have a minimum number probably of 12 because we have more finishes than we do bases. However, we try to match those finishes to the bases as best we can. So if we, the other thing we do is look for unique attributes. Again, something that's very particular to a vessel, maybe it is really, really big or really, really small, a certain color, a decorative element. A lot of later vessels have really amazing molded decorations on them that tell you what their contents were, where they were manufactured. Mineral water bottles, soda bottles, liquor bottles tend to have really great embossed decorations to help identify them. So that's what we do to do our vesselization. And what's really neat about vesselization is that it is a way to connect what happens in the field with what happens in the lab and take that basic cataloging to the next step. And it allows us to then start to ask different questions about the vessels. We can start to consider things like consumer choice. We can start to consider things, so, why are people buying certain things? What are they liking about this? We can start to consider things about diet. What are they eating? What are their influences? We know there was a lot of influence of French cuisine in the early 1800s on the American diet, particularly in Virginia. So that meant there was a whole lot more sauces, and so you needed special vessels for sauces. So we really can start to see changes in human behavior through this process, whether it's in how the vessels were used or how they were thrown away. So I hope this gives you kind of a quick little look into the vesselization process. Of course, we're going to be able to talk about this some more, but get excited. If you like puzzles, this is a really, really fun component of archaeology to get into.